Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first dynamic dialogue of the second half of this year. It's July 13th, and today we're going to talk about productivity in supply chains. For those of you who are regulars, I apologize. We have a new link this month and from now through the end of the year, and I apologize that the email did not get sent as planned. A little bit of a snafu there. So hopefully you have the link and you can join us again, either watching this online or you can join us for the next session. So this is Dynamic Dialog webinars. We do these bi-weekly, the second and fourth Tuesday of the month. And we have a 4-week month in July. In August, we have 5 Tuesdays again, and we're only going to do 2 of those, the second and the fourth. So this is a new link that I sent out today, and it's good from July through December. So those of you who subscribe will automatically get copies of the slides, and you will get also a recording, a YouTube video of the session today so that you can listen to that at your leisure in case you can't make one of our scheduled webinars. So today we're going to again dive into productivity, and we're going to start with the definition. I always like to look things up, and I love my Webster's dictionary. I have one on my phone. I have a hard copy right next to my desk. I have several actually dictionaries in the house. I'm a big fan of words and dictionaries, and I always like to look things up to see what is the real dictionary definition. So when I looked up productivity or productive, sometimes you have to go to the root of the word. It talks about yielding results and being effective in bringing something about. There's another couple of odd dictionaries there or definitions, but in general, that's how we use productivity. From an operational or a supply chain perspective, though, we use productivity to mean a ratio. That ratio is outputs to inputs. So to calculate that, you divide the outputs by the inputs. So we look at things like number of cars produced per shift. So the productivity is cars per shift. Or in a restaurant, you look at meals served per shift or per day, maybe. In a bakery, you might look at bagels produced and sold per day, per week, per month kind of thing. You can look at it through many kinds of different things, and we'll look at a few different examples of that in a minute. And these outputs and inputs apply to the workforce. They apply to the equipment that's used. They apply to time in hours, typically how you use that, but it's also can be like a shift. The thing to remember when you're calculating productivity is you want your outputs to be something of value to the organization. The inputs are what it takes to get those, and that needs to have value as well. But the outputs are really what you want to focus on. What do you want to measure in terms of productivity? What's the output that you're producing, or that your department, that your company, that whatever organization you're working with is producing? So you want something that generates value in and of itself, and you want to pick things that help your organization achieve their objectives as well. And it's important to have an alignment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's several factors that affect productivity or that are used to calculate productivity. And when we look at those, the first one is methods. And the easiest example of that is to look at something that's done on a manual basis versus something that's automated. So if you're producing widgets, if you're producing them manually, actually having people make them one by one, put things together, screw them together, fasten them together, staple them, glue them, hammer them, whatever you do, if it's a manual activity, you're going to have so much output available per person or per production line or whatever, versus automating that, where you have some kind of equipment and some kind of tooling involved that's going to help that be more of an automated process. So then you look at methods, and you should get a higher productivity with automation than with a manual method. So that's one factor that to examine. Another factor is quality. And we have the quality of our production, quality of our incoming parts, our outgoing parts. And we're looking at the total output versus what's yielded or what is good or acceptable in that output. So if you look at the total number of cookies that a bakery bakes, then that's one output. They baked all those cookies. But if you look at what was actually good enough to be sold, then you're going to lose a few. You're going to have a few more that you made than you can actually use, because sometimes the cookie gets up against the edge of the pan, so it doesn't have the right shape. Sometimes they come out a little less than, if you want cookies that are round, sometimes you have them that are a little bit funny shaped, and so that you don't sell those, you keep those back and let the workers eat those probably. You have some that may be too big or maybe too small. Sometimes the very last cookie that you make is a little bit smaller and maybe not quite big enough to be sold as a full cookie with everything else. So you have what you produce that's acceptable and it's actually usable or sellable. And then you have other items that you make that are not good. So you have yield factors. Sometimes it takes more product to go into the process than actually comes out. So you lose some things along the way. You have a little bit of scrap, or you have to rework some things, or however that works for you. So quality is another factor that affects productivity. The labor or the workforce, this is a big variable in the work. If you think about a production line, and if you have people that have worked on that production line, if you think about automobile industry, there are people that have worked on those automobile lines for Ford, for GM, for Toyota, for 15, 20 years. And then you have people that they hired in the last 6 months. So that new worker doesn't have the same productivity as the worker that's done that job for a long time. At the same time, somebody that's worked there 10 years and has done 1 or 2 jobs, if they're learning a new job, their productivity won't be as high on that new job as well, because they're learning that job. So you have differences in the ability of your workforce, differences in the experience of your workforce, and differences in the familiarity with that certain product line or that process in your workforce. And they don't all have the same ability to produce the same amount of output in the same amount of time or for the same amount of effort put into that. So you have, that's a factor. Technology, of course, is a big factor. And if you think about, I worked a lot with machine shops and sheet metal shops and any kind of machinery for production. I've done a lot of that in my career. I've done a lot of electronic things too, but I think it's easy to think about some of these machines that are old and wearing out. If you have a machine that's older, it probably needs more maintenance. It probably isn't as fast. It probably takes longer to set up and tear down than a new machine. And so it's not going to be as productive. That machine is not going to be able to produce as many items per hour or per shift as a new machine that is designed to be faster, more accurate, to set up more quickly, and to be able to switch out jobs much more quickly. So the technology involved can affect your productivity as well. And finally, the capital. So the amount that you invest in your process can vary a lot. Sometimes companies put a lot of money into designing their workstations. They put a lot of money into making sure that they have standardization, that they have automation wherever they can, that they use things like conveyors to move parts. They have ergonomic workstations so that people are more comfortable and can both sit and or stand. They can do things more efficiently. And so that will improve productivity. If you don't spend that money in the process and you don't have that standardization, and you have workers that maybe get tired from standing all day, or workers that get backaches from sitting all day and aren't allowed to do one or the other, and they have to make a lot of movement because it's not ergonomically defined, then their output is not going to be as high as another worker who is working in one of those stations that's designed for the ease and has the waste taken out of it. It's more of a lean workstation. So that one, if you put money into that process, you're going to be able to increase the output from that workstation. And then you're also looking at the money that you invest in the process versus the dollars that are involved in the material and the labor in conducting that process and completing that process. So there's a lot of different things that you can do in that area. And you want to look at how you can make sure that you're making that so that you can get as much output for whatever input you have into the process. So here's some calculations. Productivity at its simplest is output divided by input. So that can be, for example, the output, whatever you're making per labor hour. And that can be labor hour or the entire workforce, or it can be on an average per person. Output per number of machines, typically that's done in hours as well. So in the machine hours, how many hours that runs, or how many hours in the shift that's running. So sometimes the machine doesn't run when you either set it up or tear it down and you have a changeover versus running it, setting it up and running it for 3 days. But you look at the number of hours associated with the shift or with the actual runtime on that machine. And different machines allow you to track, the time from the time you started. It's like a phone call. When your phone call starts and your phone call ends, you can look at your phone afterwards and see exactly how many minutes you were on the phone. So if you want to do that, then that's a good thing to do. And if some machines have that feature as well. You can look at it as output per capital, per the dollars, again, per the dollars invested in that system or in that process, in that workstation, or in that entire production line, or the output per capital that you have in the labor and material, direct labor and material that you're investing in that process. And then you can look at it too as energy. So output per energy, sometimes it's kilowatts. Sometimes if it's a process that uses a lot of water, it might be an output per so many gallons of water, or it can be in utility dollars, what you're paying for that energy. So it can be whatever makes sense to your business. Then there are what they call partial measures. And these are, again, similar to what we just went through, which is really the single input. So maybe man hours, or maybe one person's hours, 8 hours for one person during that shift. It can be labor, can be capital, can be all that. And what you're looking for, again, is a number, the productivity that says like cars per shift, or any of the examples that I used, or anything else that anybody can think of or has used for productivity. It's that output per the amount of input. I teach at some local Cal State campuses, and one of the things I teach is productivity. And the books talk about multi-factor measures. And I've seen this sometimes in companies that I've worked with, but not often. And the reason is you put too many things together and you don't really know what's driving what. So in the books that I teach, they talk about the output per labor and machine. So they add the labor, and this is typically in hours, the machine hours plus the human hours. So you can get a number from that, or you can get a ratio from that. But I don't know that that's as valuable as doing the output per the human labor and output per machine hour, because I think that gives you a better sense of actually what you're doing and how that's working out. Then they go as far as to add all of the dollars together. So they take the output and they divide it by the labor dollars plus the capital dollars plus the energy dollars. And that's good, but whether or not that ratio goes up or down, when you have that many items in the denominator, then it's really hard to tell which one is driving which. If your productivity is increasing, then is your output increasing, or are you decreasing the labor, the capital, the energy, any two of those, or all three of those? So if your ratio is going up, it's hard to tell which of those is really affecting it. And the idea of productivity measures is that you do understand what's driving that, and you can take actions to drive that ratio so that that output to input ratio is getting stronger, that you're getting more output for the inputs that you put in there. And so that if it's in dollars, it's hard to divide that up. And then again, with total measures, sometimes that works. And the one productivity measure that I like is a restaurant looking at how many meals per shift that they serve. So that because meals are all over the place. Somebody can order a bowl of soup and that's their meal, and somebody can order a 3-course meal with appetizers and salad and an entree and a dessert, which I guess would be 4 courses. So, but a meal can be aggregated, and then you can look at how many you can serve, because that tells you not only give a good idea of how much food you're serving, but it also ties to how many customers you're able to serve. If you look at 1 meal per customer, then you can kind of count that. So sometimes that is a valuable thing to do. Again, you have to look at your business and your situation to say, what works for me? What are the important outputs and what are the inputs that I'm looking at to see as a ratio of those? So productivity is not cost control. And we talk about that a lot, but companies are always, supply chain companies or supply chain functions in companies are always looking at cost reductions. And a common assumption is that if you reduce the cost, you're going to increase the productivity. That's not always the case. And people are sometimes shocked at that. Why not? If I increase my output, or if I'm able to decrease my cost, how come my productivity doesn't go up? And the reason is because you're looking at that ratio between your inputs and your outputs. It's not as meaningful as a single number. So if you look at the example there in the blue box, it talks about pink triangles versus the green, and the total 3 pink triangles per the total of 8. So you can do a ratio of that, but it's not necessarily a good number that tells you anything. And if you do the math and divide 5 by 8, you come up with 0.6 something or other. And that number by itself doesn't tell you much. Even if you produce 200 cars per shift, the number 200 as a productivity measure, without those units of measure, it's not really meaningful. So you're not trying to get to a single value. You're not trying to do that calculation and say, oh, my number is 4 and that's a good number. And also, productivity doesn't tell you much when you take a productivity measure one time. So if you look at how many cars per shift I did today or yesterday, or even last week, you can say, okay, this is my number, but whether that number is good or not, whether that number is really meaningful and tells you how you're performing it's not really there. So you have to look at it over time. You have to track and say, am I getting better? Am I improving? Am I changing week to week, day to day, period to period, however often I'm calculating this? You really have to look at that and say, what's the important part? What's changing and what's not, and by how much? So productivity is a different thing than cost control. When we do cost control, we focus on costs that someone deems excessive. So let's go see if we can't get a cost reduction on that part. So either you as a buyer or the person that's buying it or managing that commodity says, I think I can get a better price on that. That's a good thing. But sometimes it's just, we're just going to requote all these parts, or we want to see what else we can do because someone has a feeling that a feeling, again, not data, not a study that says better pricing out there. It's just, that's going to be our target. We're going to go focus on these 3 areas and try to reduce the cost. Now, cost reduction is not a bad thing, but it's not always the thing that is going to help the business the most. So, and you find that reducing costs can meet a goal, but sometimes it doesn't improve productivity, and sometimes it makes problems in other places. Even though it's a mainstay of supply chain, cost control and productivity don't relate quite that closely. And at first glance, as I said, you think that reduced costs should lead not only to better productivity, but also higher profits. So we talked about cost reductions versus productivity, but now let's think about profitability. We know that basically revenue minus expenses, if you look at any kind of business school class, they'll tell you revenue minus expenses equals profit. So that's good. We want to do that. But if we reduce expenses, then intuitively we should be more profitable, right? So revenue minus expenses, if my revenues stay the same and my expenses go down, I'm going to make more profit. That's true. That's true on a very simple formula. But problems arise when we really look into that expenses and see how many costs there are in that bucket and how interrelated they can be. For example, have you ever changed suppliers for a cost reduction? You said, oh yeah, we found a better price. We're going to move that part. We're going to let this other supplier produce it. It's a good thing. And then suddenly found that they charge for every configuration change, every schedule modification. Every time you want to do something different, you're getting a bill for a change modification, a change bill. Or you may get a lower direct recurring price, but suddenly you find out that there's quality problems. So, and delivery problems or delivery problems. So you start out thinking you're getting a better price, but suddenly you find that your scrap is going up, your rework is going up. It takes more people to handle the products that come in because you're having to sort. And even if you don't sort, you're having to return things to the vendor because they're not correct. You're finding defects in there. And so you might have shortages and disruptions on your production line. So that lower price all of a sudden isn't such a good deal. Now, the way most companies count cost reductions, they may have said, yes, we got a cost reduction for this part. We are going to we're going to buy this many parts, maybe 1,000 parts over the next year, because that's what our forecast is. So I saved $2. Now I'm going to say, okay, 2 times 1,000, that's $2,000 that we saved by going to vendor X. But if you have to send a few lots back, if you have to do some extra rework or scrap, that $2,000 goes away pretty fast. It doesn't take a lot of people or a lot of returned lots or a lot of sorting or scrap to generate a couple $1,000s. So you may think that you got a cost reduction, but you really didn't. So you saved on the price, the base price, purchase price, but you increased costs in other areas. So your profitability did not go up necessarily. So you don't want to look to fix one problem and find out that really you changed suppliers, but you fixed something that wasn't really broken and you created other problems. So you want to be careful about how you're looking at productivity. Productivity improvements are more closely correlated to profitability increases and why is that? I ask my students, productivity is more closely correlated to profitability. Why is that? The reason is because productivity is linked to the processes and the ways things are done, the output versus the inputs required to produce them. So again, if we look at those factors that drive productivity, the methods, the quality, the labor and the workforce, technology, capital, if you have improved methods to produce the output, then you're going to reduce the inputs or increase the output, or maybe a little bit of both. So that can increase your productivity. So with the same workforce, you can make more things to sell and also increase your revenue which will allow you to increase that delta between revenue minus expenses and increase your profitability. Or you can make the same amount of a product with fewer people and make those people available to do another product or do something else that will also make money for the company. Now, if you reduce the number of people that you need to do something and don't find productive work for them, productive meaning you're increasing the output of something for the input you put in, then you're not managing the organization well, and your productivity won't relate to profitability. But if you look at it in terms of that you can free people up to do something else, and then that's going to increase your productivity, and that will also increase your profitability. The same with quality. The better the quality you have, the less rework you have, the less scrap you have, the fewer inspections you're doing, the fewer handling activities you're doing. You have fewer dispositions of material, fewer disruptions overall to your production lines, and this goes on and on. Same thing, as I said, if you buy a new machine or upgrade an aging one, it's going to run better, more efficiently, and produce more with less frequent disruptions than one that is not upgraded and up to speed. So productivity is closely related to profitability. So there's a few areas to focus on when we talk about supply chain productivity. The first is really transportation. And anybody who's in supply chain knows that a full truckload is much less expensive on a per unit cost than a less than full truckload, LTL. So we're looking at ways that we can get things like full truckloads. It's going to be an increase in productivity. So your output might be truckloads. So the number of truckloads that you have per number of full truckloads that you have per shipments made, or the number of, you can do it the other way too. How many less than full truckloads do you have? Then that's the number that you want to increase. The other thing to look at for transportation is intermodal transportation. Sometimes it's better to put things on a rail car and ship it from point A to point B and then transfer it to a truck. Sometimes it's better to put things on the water for a period of time and then transfer it to trucks and or rails. So that can actually say it may be more handling, but if you can add in those less expensive ways to move product, that may be much better than putting it in the air. So you want to look at what the outputs are for these. In the case of transportation, it's not necessarily the products that you put in there, but it's the number of full truckloads you have. And then again, what are your inputs? It may be the hours that you have worked. It may be the number of products that you're contributing to that load. But whatever works for your company is going to give you that gauge to let you know how you're doing and let you track that over time. The second area to look at is inventory. This is an area where a lot of productivity can be gained. First, by moving inventory that's not moving. So if it's aging and not being sold and not doing anything for you, you want to get that out of your warehouse. If it's obsolete and you know that you no longer have a home for that, again, you want to move that out. When you look in terms of productivity, if you look at the number of SKUs that you're managing or the number of inventory locations, if that's the input to whatever output, then if you can reduce that, that's going to improve your productivity. So if you have, and you can do that with inventory dollars, if you have inventory dollars that are aging and that's your input, if you can get that aging out, you're going to reduce that, and that's going to boost your productivity. Inventory is another area to utilize technology. Inventory you want to look at not only the inventory itself and the value of that, but how many times you have to handle it, how many moves you have to make, how many transactions you're making every day. So how much inventory do you have per the transactions? How much value do you have in that inventory? How many sales can you make per the transactions? Or maybe just how many products you can produce that are sellable, create finished goods per the amount of transactions that you have. So again, technology will help you streamline that and increase your output for whatever inputs you define. And then another thing that people don't think of often, but is becoming more common, especially with the pandemic, all of a sudden people looked at way different things they could do with their customers, is to drop ship from manufacturers. So if your suppliers are making products that are pretty much sell through, and maybe you in the past had them come into your factory, you may have packaged or repackaged them, put labels on them, and then sent them maybe to a distributor, a retailer, or directly to customers. Now, if you have the ability to have your supplier do the packaging and ship directly from the manufacturer, your supplier, to your customer, that can reduce a lot of cost, and that can improve the productivity. The outputs there are can be things like shipments made. It can be things like orders fulfilled. So you have to define what's important to you and then figure out how you can increase that ratio to whatever the input is. Procurement is another area that I find very perplexing sometimes. When you think about productivity, it's not just negotiating and squeezing another percent or two from a vendor. So you think, okay, if I'm going to be more productive, I'm going to reduce cost. Again, you have that link between productivity and cost reduction. But if you look at other activities you can do, you can, like vendor consolidation, which is one of the biggest, you can get better productivity because you look at number of SKUs purchased per supplier, you look at number of products and orders placed to different suppliers. If you can increase that productivity, placing either fewer orders or fewer orders to other than preferred suppliers, then you can track that. If you can consolidate vendors, you tend to get more volume discounts, you tend to get improved quality. You also focus your internal resources on a fewer number of suppliers, and your suppliers will increase the resources that they have to support you. So that doesn't cost your company anything, but that helps you get problems resolved more quickly, better response. And so that's going to improve productivity overall. One of the things too with procurement is maverick spend. When you order outside of your standard suppliers or outside of your purchase agreements, and that can really erode productivity. One, you're creating more orders than you should have to different suppliers. And that's a good thing to look at, is the total number of suppliers that you're issuing orders to. And then also what kinds of prices you're paying for some of that maverick spend. Sometimes you have a product that is out, your vendor is out, and you have to go somewhere else. But sometimes it's just maybe something that you're doing for safety, something that you're doing to try another product. So you want to be careful about how you manage and how you utilize that maverick spend. It can be a good thing to do occasionally, but if you find that you're finding suppliers that are running out of parts more often than not, or on a repetitive basis, then you want to look at how can I improve those supplier relationships so I can continue to consolidate that spend. And then again, quality. If you can reduce inspections, that's a good thing. Inspections add no value to your product. I'm going to repeat that. Inspections add no value to your product. All they do is verify that the level of quality that you expect, need, want, have defined is there in the parts. It doesn't add value in and of itself. It's just an extra step. So anytime you can reduce the inspections that you do, or the length of the inspections, or the thoroughness or the depth of the inspections, you're saving money, and that's going to improve productivity because you're going to be able to produce more output per the amount of labor hours spent. In this case, inspection is typically indirect labor. It's not direct labor. So you can reduce that. If it is direct labor, if that's how you classify it, you can still reduce that amount. So it's a good thing to look at. Anytime you reduce rework and scrap, if you look at, again, the amount produced versus the amount that you input into that process, the material that you consumed and were actually able to backflush and sell versus the material that went into that process, the input of that material, then you're going to improve the productivity in that way. And with quality, you always want to make sure that you have root cause identification, that you put corrective actions in place, and not only corrective actions, but preventive actions, so that the thing that you found was the root cause can't come back, or is going to be identified if something happens in that process to say, whoops, this is getting out of whack again. We don't want this to happen. So that prevention is always very important and sometimes overlooked by different organizations. So there's 5 keys to supply chain productivity. The first is to really prioritize the goals, the outcomes, the outputs. Think about what you're trying to do in your business and choose those 3 to 5 business drivers and select the outputs that go with those to measure productivity. Make sure they're aligned with overall business goals, because this is very important. Then be prepared to communicate. Ensure all the team members and all the stakeholders are aware of these goals and understand why you're doing this, especially those 3 that you prioritize, or 3 to 5 maybe. Communicate the what, the when, the why, and remember that you're going to have to do that several times, because it can take a person hearing something up to 7 times before they really process it and retain the message that you're giving them. So that communication is very important. Make sure that your workforce engaged. The best way to do that is to communicate and make sure they understand the who, what, when, where, and why of things. Focus on the skills that they need, the resources that are needed to support that, and make sure that you verify the buy-in is there. Don't assume that, okay, we told them they're going to be fine, they understand, and go on your merry way without checking to make sure that you really have a workforce that's engaged in improving the productivity and working toward the goals that you've set up, that you're monitoring with productivity measures. The 4th one is to standardize your processes and procedures. This is really important because you need to reduce the variation in your processes. Reducing the variation will improve the productivity, because it's either going to reduce the input or increase the output, or both. So that's a good thing to do. If you reduce errors, same thing. Reduce the input, increase the output, or both. If you have standardization, it's easier to track. It's easier to find root cause and put corrective actions in. If you have that kind of standardization, if you're doing the same thing over and over, or using the same parts or processes, and then it creates a common language for your organization, so that when you talk about the process or the procedures, everyone understands. And it's not, we don't call that over here, we do this differently, we call this something else, and we use that in a different way. So standardization is important, as well as documenting the processes and procedures. And lastly, train and change management. So you want to make sure your team understands what productivity is. It's not just another initiative to go find cost reductions. It is a different way of looking at the work that you're managing. Make sure you include incentives and rewards when people buy into the productivity goals that you set and actually make progress toward achieving them and ultimately achieve them. You want to weave the productivity mindset into your culture, just like you do with some of the lean and some of the diversity and inclusion, some of the other things you're trying to get into the culture. Productivity should be people looking at, okay, what is the output and how much input goes into that, and how can I change that ratio up? And then make sure you put change management strategies in place to implement and then ultimately reinforce the processes. Because if you roll this out and it doesn't stick, then it's not, you just wasted your time. So some of the drivers for change, looks like my slide didn't update here. You want to increase the competitiveness that you have within your industry. You want your company to be more competitive. So looking at productivity is a way to be more productive. It will help you manage resources. We all have limited inputs, so you want those inputs to be applied to the places where they're going to do the most good, create the most outputs. You can have people doing a lot of different things, but if those inputs aren't resulting in the outputs that you want for your organization, then you have to look at what else they're doing that's detracting that. The same thing, if you're not getting all the outputs that you want from your organization, from the activities that you're doing, you want to take a step back and say, okay, then where are my resources going? If I'm not getting the outputs, what is happening with these resources, and how can I refocus that resource that I have? Again, whether it's a person, a machine, a type of automation, capital dollars, how do I channel that back into activities that are going to produce the outputs that we both need and want in the organization? And then you're looking at, how can I look at things in a different way? If you're stuck in your business, and a lot of businesses are stuck because they say we just aren't making the progress we'd like to, then take a step back and look at it differently. Cost reduction, cost reduction, cost reduction. Every organization I've ever worked in, with, or for as a procurement organization is inundated with requests for cost reductions. There's pressure, sometimes unbelievable pressure, to reduce cost. So it's a good thing to do, but make sure you're reducing the right costs and getting the right results. Again, if you get a better price and get less quality, even if it's slightly less quality, you're not getting the total savings. You're trading something off. And if you have to make that trade-off, is that really what you want to do? So if you think about it, not only in terms of the cost reduction, but in terms of improving my productivity, if I can move that part to a supplier that I already have, it's less suppliers for me to manage. It's less relationships for me to build and maintain. It's less purchase orders for me to place. Even if you have a system that you have to place only one purchase one part number per order, you're still being able to consolidate those into one vendor, which helps ultimately improve productivity. So here's some cautions. Productivity is not a lot of things. Productivity is not effectivity. Effectivity is the ability to get a goal done, accomplished. If you have a goal and you're able to do that, your boss will tell you that was very effective. I set the bar high and you reached it. So that's a good thing. Efficiency is accomplishing that goal with a few reduced resources. And that may be that you did it more quickly. So you and another person in your organization may have a similar goal. If you can reach yours more quickly, then you're more efficient because you did it in less time. Doesn't always have to be extra people in there. It doesn't have to be a lot of other things, but if you can, with fewer resources, and those resources are time, their money, their material, their support, and all kinds of different things. So if you can do it with fewer resources, that's more efficient. Efficiency is not productivity. They are akin, but efficiency is not necessarily tied to a specific output, and it's not looking at a ratio of that output versus the input. So the cost reduction we've talked about, that is, you want to consider all those kinds of costs that go in there, because changing one may drive another one, or it may stymie progress in making inroads into that type of cost reduction. I say that singular measure. So again, when I look at productivity, I don't want a number like 5. If you say, oh, my ratio is 5 or even 5 to 1, is that it's not necessarily a meaningful or actionable value. So you have to have the units of measure on there, and you have to understand what that ratio is representing. And that goes along with what I call a one-stop shop. So you have to look at things not only by the units of measure, but look at it in different ways. So one caution is to not be looking at productivity from one perspective, especially if you're comparing products, production lines, or even plants or shifts. Consider the example that Toyota has 2 shifts producing the same vehicle. The first shift makes 200 cars per shift. The second shift is able to produce 180 cars per shift. So you say, okay, first shift makes 200 cars per shift, second shift 180, first shift is more productive. That sounds right. But then if you add another factor, you may discover that the first shift makes those 200 cars, but they only make 2 cars per person per shift because they're using a staff of 100 people. And the second shift is making 2.4 cars per person. They're producing fewer cars, 180, but they're doing that with 75 people. So if you don't look at 2 different perspectives, 2 different inputs, you may think that one is more productive than the other. So you want to make sure that you look at that so you understand what the right drivers are. Another example is a buyer's productivity. You have a buyer who issues, say, 30 purchase orders in a week, and another buyer is only issuing 20 purchase orders per week. So the output is purchase orders, the input is time or buyer's time, and the time frame is per week. So 30 purchase orders is more than 20. So you just off the bat, you say, okay, then buyer A, who produces 30 per week, is more productive than buyer B. But we know that all purchase orders, are not created equally. So consider that those 30 purchase orders might have only 1 or 2 line items per order. So if they have 2 line items, 30 purchase orders, 60 line items, okay, that's a pretty good amount of work. But the 20 purchase orders might have an average of 5 lines per order. So 5 lines, 20 orders, that's 100 line items that were ordered. So does that mean that buyer 2 is more productive? I don't know. Or maybe all the 20 orders that the buyer 2 issues are for items that have to do with RFQs and a lot of detail and unique purchases versus the 30 that are all orders for catalog off-the-shelf parts. Which buyer is more productive, and which is the right way to measure that? These are questions that you have to really look at. So if you want to understand the productivity of a buyer, you have to set up the parameters and you have to choose your outputs and inputs so that they're relatively the same, so that you don't say, oh, buyer number 1 did 30 purchase orders, they're much more productive than somebody who only did 2/3 of that. It's difficult to measure and difficult to quantify the difficulty of a purchase order or the complexity of a purchase order. So you might have to do that on a person by person basis. Somebody that buys the same types of parts, look at what they do over time. So one buyer, maybe it's a senior buyer that has a lot of difficult RFQ parts, doesn't have as many production order or purchase orders that they're issuing every week. But if they can figure out a way to increase the number that they are able to issue or manage or close, however you want to look at the output per that time, that's increasing productivity. And the same thing for the buyer who's buying more catalog parts, off the shelf parts. If they can increase their output for the amount of input, that's increasing productivity, and those are good things to do. And that leads to my final note of caution, which is productivity numbers aren't good or bad. And a single calculation really tells you nothing about that. So you need to determine the outputs and the inputs that are meaningful to your organization. Make sure you refer to the units, but you have to track these over time. You can come up with a number that's 50 to 1, and you can think that's great, or you can come up with a number that's 1 per every 5 input and think, oh, my productivity is terrible because it's 1 divided by 5, that's 20%, that's terrible. If the 1 is the right output and it takes 5 of those to make that, then that's fine. But you want to say, can I improve this over time? So can I make that 1 to 5 ratio, maybe 1 to 4, or maybe 2 to 8, which is going to increase that ratio. So you have to look at that over time and know that you might have to tweak your inputs and outputs, compare and contrast on more than one basis. And you might have to do that regularly. We're going to look at cars per shift, but we're also going to look at cars per people on that shift. And that's okay. And don't panic if you get one poor data point. So if you're moving along and all of a sudden 1 week you have a bad productivity, it doesn't necessarily mean everything's gone south. It takes a few data points to indicate a trend, negative or positive. So track it over time and see what you can do to improve that ratio. So what I know for sure is there's a better way to manage the supply chain. And using productivity provides some transparency into the health of your business, and it's closely related to profitability. So Einstein supposedly said, not everything that matters can be measured, and not everything that can be measured matters. So whether he said that or not, I think that is brilliant. And I always try to think about that when I'm choosing my metrics or my outputs and inputs. What's most important to your organization? What can you measure readily? But also, what matters to you. So look at what matters to you and figure out how to measure it. If it's hard to measure, it's not going to make a good metric, and it probably won't be meaningful to participants and or stakeholders. And don't ever forget to celebrate your success and your progress. It's very important that you include the whole team in that. So that's what we have for today for Dynamic Dialogue. Next week, or in 2 weeks, on the 27th, we're going to talk about lean supply chains. Then in August, we're going to look at leveraging supplier relationships. And also in August, capacity planning with suppliers. So we'll talk about capacity planning and how that works for customers to look at their suppliers. So if you want to check out this and other activities we have, you can go to my website, purple-link.net, and to the events page, or you can contact me directly at jane@purplelink.net. If you want to discuss further about this or any other topic, or have other topics you'd like to suggest, you can always set up a call with Jane. If you go to http://callwithjane.com or just callwithjane.com, that should take you right to my calendar. And please note that we're going to have a CPSM Exam 3 class starting in September. It's never too early to sign up for that. We're going to do a risk-based thinking and decision-making workshop for 3 weeks, an hour and a half a week, starting in September, and then starting in October, a quick Lean in Six Sigma supply chain for supply chains the week of October. And as always, I like to leave you with a thought for the week. Tim Ferriss says, focus on being productive instead of being busy. This is one of the areas that is really hard to sometimes integrate, but this will help you integrate that into your culture. If you think about not just being busy, but being productive, actually getting output for the inputs you put in. And if you don't know who Tim Ferriss is, he is an entrepreneur and kind of a guru. He's the one that talks about the 4-hour work week, which I don't necessarily think is doable, at least for me. I wish it was, but he's got some really good ideas, and I really like that. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and I'll take